So today we're going to talk about Reconfiguring Faith, which we sort of touched on in November when we just met in the aftermath of a huge tragedy that some of us were connected to. So I didn't have that chapter written. So we had a conversation instead. So after that, I wrote the chapter that you're going to hear today. And then I think we are going to meet in May. We usually don't, and I haven't scheduled it, but I think, we might as well since we're all at home and there's only one chapter left, which will be practicing magic. So I'm kind of excited about that. So without further ado, I'm going to just start reading unless somebody has a comment or a question before we start. And then afterwards, just feel free we just kind of open it up. And so I'd love to hear anything that any thoughts the chapter has stimulated or anything that's made you think of. It's not necessarily a, great writing or that really sucked or you should try this or you should try that kind of a conversation. It's more of, just, wow, here's what I thought about when I was listening, or here's a question I have, or that kind of thing. Okay? Ready? Let me take a little sip. Reconfiguring Faith. Quote, "If you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief." Brene Brown. End quote. I wonder if one day I won't feel angry about the faith it takes to be human, to live trusting in the unfolding instead of the plan and the budget and the success. Hillary Wolf. I must have been about 6 or so, walking on the sidewalk with my mother in front of the State Theater in downtown Rapid City, South Dakota. We encountered a man whose legs had been amputated mid-thigh. He was selling pencils on the sidewalk for $0.05 apiece. He had a cup holding the pencils and a small basket for the money. I had a quarter in my pocket and felt compelled to give it to him, not only out of generosity because I felt compassion for him, not only out of respect — he was selling, not begging technically, and as such could have been respected for engaging in an honest trade despite his disability. Most of all, though, I was simply overwhelmed by the plight of this man. I felt the shock of seeing someone without legs, instantly imagining what it must be like to have your legs cut off. I felt repulsed by the strangeness of the man. I felt shame on his behalf for his disability. I felt a horrible sense of guilt for the privilege of having legs when he had none. Most of all, I felt compelled to respond in some way. The fact that I had legs and he did not, I had a quarter and he needed money, created a crisis for me. So I gave up my quarter, mostly to shut down the storm of swirling emotions as soon as possible. I put my coin in the basket, knowing he needed money, but also knowing I didn't really need a pencil, and started walking away. He called out after me, urging me to take a pencil, and since I had given him a quarter, offering me change for the transaction. Feeling I had done something terribly wrong, I froze on the spot and started to cry. My mother, no doubt feeling as powerless as I, grabbed my hand and walked me to the car, offering some kind of response I'm sure I was incapable of processing at that moment. In some ways, this event set the course for my interaction with humanity for the rest of my life. I became frightened by the possibility that a tragedy like this could strike anyone at any moment. And not only was I powerless to prevent it from happening to me, I would be powerless to adequately help anyone who might be struck down by tragedy in the future. No amount of quarters was going to make things right again for any of us. Today, when I step back from my privilege and tune into the thousands of ways our fellow humans are struggling all over the world at this very moment, I can still feel crushed by the enormity of worldwide suffering. I'm struck by the utter tragedy of humanity, the desperate vulnerability of us all in the midst of the random, unjust, and senseless disasters that happen daily to so many. In these moments, I can still feel like that 6-year-old standing on the sidewalk, witnessing the horror, wondering if that measly quarter in my pocket can do any good at all. Conscious contact with vulnerability is a difficult sensation to tolerate for any length of time. We want to act. We want to act in some way that resolves the feeling of nakedness in the face of threat. So most of us come up with a method or two to protect ourselves from that sensation. Some of us choose to fortify. We take every available action to control and prevent disaster, both individually and collectively, and live in constant vigilance thereafter. This option has driven the development of humanity since the beginning of thought. Shelter, community, commerce, law, innovation, education, and medicine are a few of humanity's brilliant responses to the vulnerability of being human. Control and predict, fortify, and defend. Some of us fall into despair. Those who have not experienced disaster have a hard time understanding despair. We're shocked and bewildered watching lives cut short by suicide or wasted by addiction and violence. We're ignorant of the effects that poverty, oppression, abuse, war, and trauma can have on a person's will to live. Some say that if you're not feeling hopeless in the face of the enormity of the human condition, you're not paying attention. Sometimes I think those who take their own lives in the face of real or impending disaster are those who are unable to look away from the whole human catastrophe. They get exhausted by the sheer tragedy of it all and finally give in to despair. I'll wager that most of us choose merely to numb the awareness of our fragility. We pretend. We manage to live as if we're not vulnerable. We find ways to assure ourselves that somehow we're lucky or blessed, worthy or exempt from the ravages of random disaster, even when we know down deep we're just as vulnerable as the next person. The mental constructs we build to keep us from experiencing our vulnerability are what existentialists call illusions. The illusion of safety, the illusion of control, the illusion of reciprocity, fairness, and security. We call them illusions because they help us mask the truth that literally anything can happen to us at any moment, despite all our plans and fortresses. Wrapping myself in illusion isn't a bad way to go, because expecting disaster might strike at any moment is really no way to live. Fight or flight leaves little room for creativity, innovation, and problem solving. Better to live as if I am secure, as if I am invincible, as if the world is fair. These illusions help me move out of my reptile brain and into my capacity for mastery. My illusions buffer my vulnerability long enough to help me risk beating the odds, and most of the time I do. Privilege, mood-altering substances, addictions, hobbies, superstitions, tinfoil hats, and just plain old ignorance will do in a pinch. But long ago I figured, why mess around with run-of-the-mill self-protection strategies? Why not go straight for the top and make friends with the one who runs the world? I have held an instinctive knowledge of my ultimate vulnerability somewhere in my body from an early age. And I spent many of my waking hours trying to push that knowledge down out of my consciousness. So when I was presented with the story of a savior, an all-powerful, loving being who would draw me in and protect me, I gratefully went all in. Faith systems, in my opinion, are some of the most functional strategies for dealing with the reality of the human condition. They make room for goodness and virtue while offering a sense of order and safety in the face of randomness and bewilderment. At their best, they offer community, a coherent worldview, explanations for things, and the kind of comfort that comes from knowing why, knowing how to behave, how to belong, how to cooperate with God for the benefit of humanity. There are worse ways to cope with being human, I think. Unfortunately, while I was safely ensconced in the buffer that was my faith system, I chose a profession that put me in a position to witness the human condition up close. Sitting with my clients through the most difficult times of their lives, exposing me to the damaging effects of injustice, intentional cruelty, bad luck, trauma, and delusionment, it chipped away at my religious worldview. My illusions began to slip, and I became unsure. The more unsure I became, the more vulnerable I felt. The more vulnerable I felt, the more I reached for better illusions, bigger, better narratives for how it all makes sense. I adopted sophisticated theologies that protected my image of God as wise and good and in control, and the church as a refuge of goodness in the world. Some religious people break around the fact that bad things happen to good people and God doesn't seem to do anything about it, much less prevent it like they think he should. That idea gave me pause along the way, but I managed to grow through it. Some people drop out of their childhood faith because they get bored with church and move on. The church was the surrogate family that promised to let me belong and give my life meaning, so no, I wasn't bored. But the conviction that the church was a refuge of goodness in the world, that was the illusion that when it broke me too. I was a therapist who worked primarily with people in my faith system. Because I was a therapist who worked primarily with people in my faith system, I became someone they turned to when they suffered abuse from that same system. The injustice, the plain wrongness of the way so many of my clients had been treated by those who had been charged to shepherd and protect them, these things became an increasingly heavy burden for me. The rampant reality of spiritual abuse illuminated a growing split inside me. I found it harder and harder to maintain my devotion to the church while witnessing the rubble of lives that had been devastated by abuse of power, betrayal of trust, and in some cases, outright crimes committed by agents of the church. So when I broke hard, and boy was I angry about it. During that turbulent time in my life, I wrote this. The church marches on with their good news of personal salvation and self-righteousness, raking in the dough and feeding people stuff that would likely choke the man they profess to follow. Maybe he's more understanding than I, but it makes me sick in a surreal sort of way. Assuming Jesus did die for something, I just can't imagine he died to produce what passes for church in most places. I just can't. So now what? What do I really believe? What if I believe nothing? And what if I have nothing to offer the universe, my family, or my friends? What then? Lots of people have arrived at this point and hardened themselves into resentful old folks, sarcastic and cynical and bitter. That's very tempting. The world does not operate as it should, and I have no power to make it behave. The sense of rightness about my opinion fuels all the cells of my body. Some things are just wrong, damn it, and I can't understand why good does not triumph. This makes no sense at the core of me, and I resist it with my last breath. I feel betrayed to the core. Yes, betrayal is what I feel, what I struggle against, and what I feel furious about. I believed, for God's sake, hope against hope, and for what?
We're creating with that right
sorry.
now.
Resentment and resignation seep through my pores and threaten to drown me. I'm angry at the theys. They broke the deal. They committed wrong. They didn't play by the rules as I did. No fair. Now I see there is no reward, and look what I've sacrificed for nothing. I feel relieved to admit I don't believe anymore, and I feel hope that if I let go my rules, I might find another way. But I suspect that new way is still going to require faith of some kind, trust in some goodness somewhere, somehow. I see it all around me, people who believe in a way that lights them up inside, people who hold out hope that dreams come true, people who dare to be held by something bigger, people occasionally receiving miracles somehow. On the other hand, people who never dare to believe seem to get nothing. This is my dilemma. I'm afraid I'm still required to hang my heart out there and trust in some goodness, but I don't know how to convince my heart to let go of its betrayal. The world is run by assholes who feed on, indeed depend on, the naive goodness of true believers. They eat that stuff for breakfast and put out the call for more, manipulating, harvesting, and raping the goodness from our souls, turning it into the shit they ask us to eat day after day. And so we do, with conviction. Didn't Jesus say something about millstones and causing little ones to stumble? Is there no justice at all? This was a very turbulent time, a period in which I allowed myself to feel as angry as I felt for as long as I needed to feel it, toward all the people I believe deserve the enormity of my wrath for all time. But truthfully, why was I so angry? Why did I fume and sputter, thrash and complain, rail and lament for so long? When I drill down to the core, what was it that fueled my rage, my fury, my righteous indignation? Honestly, I was angry that my vulnerability buffer, the scheme I attached myself to in order to shield myself from being nakedly human, the system I adopted to protect me from all the bad things I didn't know how to cope with, failed me, leaving me exposed, unprotected, and unsupported, thrashing around in the weightlessness of not knowing, desperately trying to find which way is up. Brene Brown writes, "If you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief." Check, 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 and check. I was angry about the naked realization that my faith system didn't protect me from the reality of being fully human, which is what I wanted it to do. I thought that since I was a member of God's special group, I could count on God to protect me, shield me from the misfortune in a way that I couldn't count on if I wasn't a member of the group, as if my faith entitled me to members-only privilege. I thought faith was something like an insurance policy against vulnerability, a way to outsource all those scary feelings by securing my membership in a protected community. I also thought that faith was the only way I was going to be eligible for all the good things that life has to offer: wholesomeness and beauty, good fortune and happiness. I had no idea that my faith system was intended to be a necessary stepping stone toward actual faith, not just another vulnerability buffer to help me avoid the terror of being human. My faith system, as I understood it, suddenly felt like a cosmic bait and switch scheme, a giant adventure in missing the point, a decades-long investment in some kind of psychic side hustle. When I paused from angrily blaming the ones who sold me my faith system, I had to admit to myself that it was exactly the kind of deal I had been looking for. They delivered a product I desperately wanted. I was the one who wanted the special sauce that would enable me to skip over that whole messy human thing and send me straight to heaven without a scratch. So who is ultimately responsible for the fact that it failed? Me. I am. I desperately wanted something to shield me from the experience of being human, and I was willing to use faith as a way to accomplish that feat. Because I always thought that faith meant believing in something, a particular something. And a particular something can take many forms: God, karma, high-frequency vibrations, the force, science, or any number of ideologies that frame our existence in an understandable way. This idea puts the emphasis on the object of faith versus the act of believing. As soon as I invest in an object of faith, I effectively outsource my experience of vulnerability. My object carries the weight of vulnerability for me and shields me from having to feel it. If I have a robust enough object, I can continue to avoid feeling vulnerable. I put my faith in the bank that is God, and not only am I protecting myself from vulnerability, I accrue interest for eternity. I no longer believe this is the correct understanding of faith. Instead of a way to offload my vulnerability onto the worthy object of my faith, I now see faith as a kind of raw capacity I need for authentic living. In the old Minnesota public radio show, A Prairie Home Companion, Garrison Keillor created a mock advertisement for powder milk biscuits, a product he claimed would give shy persons the strength to get up and do what needs to be done. I now suspect that's what faith has always been, the fuel that enables us to get up and do what needs to be done. Maybe we should call it strength instead of faith, or power, courage, inspiration perhaps. Sometimes I just like to call it juice, just to emphasize faith's fuel-like quality. Because if I'm going to stand without illusion, unguardedly human in the face of all the possible glories and/or catastrophes that might come to me at any moment, I'm going to need some juice for that. When it comes to touching the possibility of living from my true soul, the joy of accessing the ground of my own being, some kind of juice is required. I might need a powder milk biscuit or two to sustain me, to keep me from reaching for another scheme that will buffer the raw experience of being fully present without illusion. Because living from my true soul and accessing the ground of my own being is all about becoming fully present without guarantees. I now believe that faith is the raw capacity to experience being completely and nakedly present. Present without the story of my identity, present without the fortress of my security plan, present without the many narratives I use to justify my existence, present without anticipating an imaginary future, present without the burden of my past, present without judgment, present without resistance or cover of any kind, present and open to experiencing the glory of being human. I'm starting to believe that. Faith is the juice that gives me the capacity to stand excruciatingly present to the full catastrophe of the human condition. The terror and the beauty, the tragic and the magical, the inexpressibly horrible, as well as the unbearable loveliness of it all. Faith is the courage to be present with reality however it presents itself, without reaching for something to shield me from the raw experience of it. Faith is the juice I need to move through my existence in the direction of goodness, wholeness, beauty, and the joy of pure being. Faith is also the substance that enables me to baby step my way into authentic, soulful, day-to-day experience without the illusions that used to get me through. But more than that, faith is the capacity to experience the fullness of being. Ironically, that's the closest thing to divine I can imagine. All those years later, I continue to be astonished that I adopted a faith system so I could protect myself from the fear of vulnerability. I was willing to give everything I had in service to my faith system, trusting it would thoroughly protect me from the horrors of actually having to live by faith. Isn't that just the most ironic thing you've ever heard? I'm just going to read that again. I was willing to give everything I had in service to my faith system, trusting it would thoroughly protect me from the horrors of actually having to live by faith. I confess that sometimes, like my friend Hillary in the quote above, I'm still a little bit angry. I'm angry that I spent decades of my life invested in something that ultimately failed me. I feel angry that I was duped by my own need to avoid hard things. And now I know that just because I belong to some kind of thought community, I don't get a pass that exempts me from being human. I'm angry that there are no guarantees when it comes to what may come. But most of all, I'm angry because after the rubble of my faith system was scraped away, I still found myself in need of some kind of juice that gives me the guts to open to all the possibilities. I'm angry because it takes a lot of energy to be fully present. Being fully present takes a lot of energy without any guarantee that my life will be backed up safely. That was the thing I was looking for when I signed up with Jesus. I'm angry because becoming fully present goes against the grain of all my instincts, all my illusions, and all the ways I've come to understand who I am. In order to practice becoming fully present, and then to learn to live fully present come what may, I am intentionally moving in direct opposition to my felt identity, my mental constructs, my stories about my past, and my imaginations about the future. Coming fully present feels like I'm working against everything that makes me human, and that is the most potent illusion of all time. It's so much easier, it seems to me, to fortify as much as I can and wrap myself in as many good illusions as I need in order to feel relatively safe and hopeful at all times. I love a good system that guarantees all the benefits of modern, prosperous, happy living, lasting my entire life and then launching me into a blissful eternity after death. That dream dies hard. I wanted it so badly. I was willing to devote decades of my life, money, and energy, what we used to call time, talent, and treasure, to nail that sucker down. I wanted it so badly I was willing to invent new narratives and sell them to myself against my own instincts in order to keep the dream alive for as long as I could. But, quote, the only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate through our intimacy with disappearance. Our choice is to inhabit vulnerability as generous citizens of loss, robustly and fully, or, conversely, as misers and complainers, reluctant and fearful, always at the gates of existence, but never bravely and completely attempting to enter, never wanting to risk ourselves, never walking fully through the door. David White. The process of trading my authenticity for security, while simultaneously tuning into my soul as best I could, let me just read that again. The process of trading my authenticity for security while simultaneously tuning into my soul as best I could inevitably split me apart. You can't do both for any length of time. It's just not sustainable. Inhabiting my innate vulnerability by daring to show up fully engaged in every moment of my life, come what may, takes some juice, but only a little bit. Just enough to get up and do what needs to be done. Just enough for one baby step outside my comfort zone, and then another, and then another. Wasn't it Jesus who said we could do some incredible things if we only had faith the size of a mustard seed? That must be some kind of powerful juice. The end. So, oh gosh. So I'm really interested in your thoughts, your questions, whatever. Don't forget to unmute yourself when you want to say something. And thanks for listening. Kelly wants me to read it again. That's a lot. Really?
I would totally listen. I would totally listen to you read Faith as Presence again. That was just so, that was juicy, you know.
Faith is present. So, like, yeah, raise your hand if you want some pieces reread. Okay. Um, do you need the whole thing? No. That was a long time. So.
Go back to the part about where you're talking about faith versus presence.
Okay.
I need to see faith as a capacity I need to experience presence for that stuff.
You want to hear the stuff about the powder milk biscuits again? I'll just start there. Okay. After that. Okay. I now suspect that's what faith has always been, the fuel that enables us to get up and do what needs to be done. Maybe we should call it strength instead of faith, or power, courage, inspiration perhaps. Sometimes I like to call it juice, just to emphasize faith's fuel-like quality. Because if I'm going to stand without illusion, unguardedly human in the face of all the possible glories and or catastrophes that might come to me at any moment, I'm going to need some juice for that. When it comes to touching the possibility of living from my true soul, the joy of accessing the ground of my own being, some kind of juice is required. I might need a powder milk biscuit or two to sustain me, to keep me from reaching for another scheme that will buffer the raw experience of being fully present without illusion. Because living from my true soul and accessing the ground of my own being is all about becoming fully present without guarantees. I now believe that faith is the raw capacity to experience being completely and nakedly present. Present without the story of my identity. Present without the fortress of my security plan. Present without the many narratives I use to justify my existence. Present without anticipating an imaginary future. Present without the burden of my past. Present without judgment. Present without resistance or cover of any kind. Present and open to experiencing the glory of being human. I'm starting to believe that faith is the juice that gives me the capacity to stand excruciatingly present to the full catastrophe of the human condition. Faith is the courage to be present with reality, however it presents itself, without reaching for something to shield me from the raw experience of it. Faith is the juice I need to move through my existence in the direction of goodness, wholeness, beauty, and the joy of being. Faith is also the substance that enables me to baby step my way into authentic, soulful, day-to-day existence without the illusions that used to get me through. But more than that, faith is a capacity to experience the fullness of sheer being. Ironically, that's the closest thing to divine I can imagine. And then all the angry business. Is that what you were asking for, Sage?
Well, I was thinking of the part that came before that, but that's fine.
Oh, the part that came before that?
It's when you started talking about faith as presence. Before the powder milk, I think it's
and
fine.
before all the
it's
angry
nice
stuff. Okay, all right. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
It's my first time through, so I'm not sure I'm remembering it correctly.
Oh, yeah, I know it's hard.
Thank you.
It's a lot of stuff.
I couldn't help but think about what about Bob and baby steps.
Yeah.
and it's, for me, it's very reassuring thinking about what's the next right thing, what's the next step, and how sometimes an entire life is created just by taking the next step. When we look back, we can see it, but as we're standing here looking forward, it feels like there's just huge stuff that needs to get done, and it needs to be done now. And so that really resonated with me in terms of just enough.
There was so much there. I wish I had taken notes. That was great. And I'm glad you read that part over. I was thinking, particularly in that part, that I need to grow my own willingness to expose who I am and to be present in that way, because my fallback is that I am my story, and my fallback is all those false narratives. And I honestly do not have a whole lot of experience in being present in that naked and unashamed way without the buffer of all of that stuff that I've used to self-identify, but even more so to self-propel so that you'll see me in a particular way.
Yeah.
So I took that as a personal invitation for growth, and it's needed. I need that. I don't have a faith reconstruction in my background because I never had a dogmatic faith to reconstruct from. So in that way, I do feel fortunate in that I don't have the pain or the growth steps that go along with emerging clean from a situation like that. Although I have been in the recovery movement for many, many, many years, and that can also be dogmatic. So I always had to be sure that that's speaking truth to me. Anyway, I guess I'll just leave it there for now, but I am appreciating that invitation.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. And I do want to say, my experience was my experience, and there are plenty of people who use faith properly. I personally think it's there to kind of be a scaffolding or the forms, because we all need stuff to hold on to. We need to be formed by probably something. It's not like we can just free fall all the time. But I think that like everything, the ego tends to co-opt stuff, even the most important things. And so religion is no different than that. And will set up really firm structures, and then the structures become the thing. And then pretty soon we're not talking about faith anymore, we're talking about structures. And then all we have to do is hold on to the structure, and isn't that nice? Isn't that special? And so that was the thing that just like landed on me like a lightning bolt, was that I had 35 years worth of story and really good stuff, really good explanations for things. And when that collapsed and fell apart, I just thought, wait a minute, that was all narrative, that was all beliefs, that was all assertions, that was all ideas. And where's my faith? Actual faith. What is faith? And it just really hit me as very ironic that a person could spend their whole life grasping beliefs and thinking that they had faith. Because when I scraped it off, it was like, oh my God, I'm just as scared and vulnerable and unsure that anybody cares or there's anything out there or that I mean anything at all, or, all those really deep existential fears just came roaring back. And I was using faith to kind of, I offloaded all those things into all those ideas. So I didn't have to struggle with that. Plus, I didn't want to be a human being. I wanted to be, some kind of angel or heavenly being or, Jesus himself. And so, anyway, I just want to make clear that, people who have faith and use faith system to help them have trust and help them be present and help them, get from point A to point B. That's what it's there for. And so, yeah, I might have to say something about that.
Anyone? Bueller?
Wait a minute. I didn't see it. Oh, wait.
Are you muted yourself?
Mary, I didn't get the chat. For some reason it didn't, I couldn't read the whole thing. Can you?
Okay. Two things. One is you talk about the safety net in a very critical way. Obviously, this guarantee. We use faith as this guarantee to protect us from our vulnerability of being the human condition, being in the human condition, et cetera, et cetera. But then you just talked about a scaffolding, that there's an appropriate way that some people actually do use faith as the scaffolding. And I'm confused about the difference between a safety net and a scaffolding. Just in that, functionally, what's the difference?
Okay, well, I think there's a difference between faith and faith, faith and a faith system. And so faith to me is the juice. The faith system, or any kind of system really, is the scaffolding. And so we all will, from time to time, need some kind of scaffolding. And I think that religious system, faith systems at their best, are ways to kind of help guide us, help, give your mind like a way to understand some things, so that when you need to trust, you can trust. When you need to take a step, you can take a step. It's the juice that helps you take a step that is actual faith. It's a dynamic kind of, that's why I like to call it juice or a substance. The system is the scaffolding that kind of gives you the permission or the whys or the how it all makes sense or whatever. And honestly, in my opinion, one is as good as another, as long as it points you toward the inevitability of taking risks or being whole, or toward the something more of the soul or something. I mean, if that's God, if that's Jesus, if that's somebody else, in my opinion, from my perspective around the soul, which is the subject of the book, anything that, like, the soul requires presence and requires guts and requires, courage and trust and a little bit of magic or whatever. And so that to me is the substance of faith. And so as long as your system doesn't get in the way of that, like mine did, because I set it up that way. I wanted it to do that. And so that's why it had to be torn down. And then, to me, it was really scary to just be. And I missed that. Missed that little point there. And so not everybody does that. And so they get to do what they want. But me, I had to stop using my faith system for what it, wasn't designed to do, basically.
That clears it up. Because the other thing that really stood out to me, Phil, was how we define faith as the object of faith instead of the act of faith. And that's a tremendous watershed to me. And I mean, again, similar faith background. I remember just so dutifully explaining in my little evangelistic appointments that the object of your faith is what matters. You wouldn't get onto an airplane that looked raggedy. What you put your faith in really matters. And that was so cliche for this blindly yielding to this structure, this exterior authority, instead of the act of faith. It's the object of the faith that we sold shamelessly.
Yeah. Well, and as long as, see, I think that my beef with religious systems is that they don't really support people in their full spiritual growth. They kind of stop at the stage that reinforces their thing. You know, you can't have people growing outside the system you created for them, because then they leave you, and that's no good. And so rarely do you find a faith system or a church or a synagogue or a community that allows people to grow spiritually beyond the confines of the scaffolding. Whether or not you actually still believe in God or not. It's not like evolved people don't believe in God. And so if you still believe in God, you're not evolved. I don't know that that's true. I just think that when it comes to developing your soul, there are some ways you need to grow beyond a lot of your own mental constructs and your own ideas of what you are and what reality is and all of that. And learn how to cope with the unknown, and learn how to practice being present with yourself, and learn how to the other things that are in my book. So does that make sense? So it's tricky because I think we're all just trying to do our best, and just like kids growing up need a family, you can't just birth a child and leave them out in the wilderness. You know, they need structure, and they need being held, and they need, a holding environment, and they need to be taught things. And so a faith system is kind of like that and can do a lot of good.
I'll say something.
Yay!
One thing that this brings up for me, it seems like in my journey, a lot of faith has been kind of, or at least started out as an escape from reality. And I think I have been thinking of it especially lately in relationship to fear and what we're all going through right now and how scary this is. I think me 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, I would have very much been, my faith would have been an exercise in pretending that I was not afraid, and a denial that things are scary, and a denial that things are hard. And I would have felt really obligated or duty bound to not be afraid and to not doubt the thing. And so it was kind of a, I don't know, it was this big shelf that I could put all of those things on and close the doors and I'm like, and so I think the contrast that you're drawing is interesting and helpful to me, that it can be being present with your fear, and it can be a way of growing and moving forward, even though things are scary and even though things are hard, and that we can be afraid. And that doesn't mean that we're bad people or we don't have faith, or, I think those are the things that I would have always felt. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because I think this fear and this difficulty is going to be with us for a while. And I would have exhausted myself being, with my blinders on and pretending that reality wasn't here. So
yeah.
Current context that everything that you're saying is kind of making me think of that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious about the year before and after with, here I'm coming through, I'm gonna mute you.
Your before and after with the pencil example, like what did your faith system tell you to do, and what does your faith tell you now?
So the question is the before and after with the first encounter with the guy.
Yeah.
Well, I was only 6. I had no faith. I mean, I really had no faith. I was sent to Sunday school, but that's Sunday school, and I was just in a family system where I was a little bit lost anyway. And so, and in a system where you're not sentimental, we don't do feelings, we don't talk about important things, but I'm kind of a hypersensitive, empathic little girl in the, and I'm seeing something for the first time that I've never seen before, and just the horror of it. It just went straight to fear, and I think that I absorbed a lot of things right in that moment. That I used the story to just kind of describe the shock of reality early on as a child, and how I kind of absorbed that in that one encounter. Like, holy cow, what happened to that man? Why doesn't he have any legs? And how horrible would that be? And who would you be if you had to sit on the sidewalk and sell pencils and people feel gross about you? And oh my God, kind of like, if that could happen to him, it could happen to anybody. And what a terrible thing to have to deal with. That just hit me in the moment. And I think children can absorb that kind of thing. And at that age, it just burns into your nervous system and your limbic system that the world is dangerous and anything could happen at any time. And I'm kind of on my own here because there's not a whole lot of supports. So it was an internalized sense of vulnerability and fragility, and kind of the weird idea that just really anything could happen to anybody. And so plus the fear about, the powerlessness, like, how can I make a difference? Like, I have to do something, but it's not really going to help him. And, what I have is meager and inadequate. And so I think that 6-year-old experience really went to the core of me, and probably was the core thing that kept getting triggered the 3 times that I burned out as a therapist. I would just get overwhelmed. Like, there's needs. Being a therapist is like, okay, I got tools, I can help. I got more than a quarter in my pocket. And then the first wave was like, oh my God, there's not enough money in that pocket. So burned out, moved to Colorado, took 4 years off, started again. I got another, thing. And then, I guess there's only 2 times I really burned out. Seems like 3, but I can't remember them all. But the second time, it was like, oh my God, I thought I was equipped. I thought I had more quarters in my pocket, and spent all my quarters and didn't have anything left, and didn't know how to separate myself from the suffering of the world, and tried but couldn't, and it just took me down. So that was a very core experience for me. And so I think that drove my sense of vulnerability. I think I carried that with me all the time. And so then when people started talking about Jesus in high school, and, all of the things that we were assuring people of, I just was like, a hot dog, sign me up. Yay, this is great. Which is fine, has probably helped me, probably saved my sanity. It probably kept me from all kinds of horrible things that I might have gotten into, or mental illnesses I could have had, or it did what it did. But because I was so invested in protecting my vulnerability, I did what a lot of people do, is just put that trust in something about the system, rather than try to deal with the real issues that I wasn't equipped to deal with. Yeah, Hope, go ahead. Where are you? Oh, there you moved.
No, she just moved. So the faith system.
I've noticed that
gratefully
when I
embrace.
ask myself if I have faith, I feel like I'm talking about a feeling. I feel that in my heart. And when I ask myself, do I have faith in, then it becomes more of a mental construct for me. Because then it's a what rather than a feeling. And I was just wondering if anybody else had that experience, that it becomes a construct. And the other thing that you talked about early on in your reading was about being saved. And I've noticed and also I noticed in our political world, but then also, I don't know how many of you have seen, I think it's HBO, it might be Netflix, it's called Messiah. It's excellent. It really examines the addiction we have to being saved. And the addiction we have to being saved, it's like I noticed, Governor Cuomo in New York makes these really strong, sensible statements. Great. And then in social media, he has now been raised to guru status.
Yeah.
Because that saves us. And I wonder, what is faith in and what are we saved from? And those are the questions that have come up for me.
If anybody else wants to answer that before I jump in, raise your hand. I'll let you talk. That's a big, hefty question there. I think what you said was, what do we have faith in? And
No, I have no question that I have faith. And when I ask myself what I have faith in, that changes. That's not a constant for me.
yeah. Somehow, Hope, I see that you're not muted, but there you are.
I have faith in a power greater than myself. That works for me, but it's also a little nebulous.
Well, I'm not sure we can really survive without trusting in things. There are certain assumptions we make every single day just to get out of bed and do things. And kind of holding on to some guiding thing that's true, or that we believe is true, to kind of help calm us down and to kind of move through and then take whatever steps we need to take. I think that's totally fine. It's not wrong to trust ideas or to trust in a lot of things. We have to, just to get through our life. I just think that when it comes to your soul moving through the world and growing into what you can be, that we need something to get us out of the ego's scheme to substitute one thing for another, to co-opt the real deal about being alive. And so I'm kind of struggling to make the nuance here, but if we're not careful, we can reduce down some really important spiritual realities to, well, this is bad, this is good, do this, not that. Think this way, not that way, and we got it. When really it's a lot more personal and a lot more in the moment than that. And so to resist, if you can, the mind's desire to reduce everything down to something that's predictable and controllable, and instead just notice that, oh, I feel kind of naked here, and what can that teach me? How can I be present with that? And once I get across that threshold, what's available to me? If we never cross the threshold for whatever reason, then there are some things we don't get to experience, we don't get to learn, or we learn it, piecemeal a little bit. But I don't want to imply that if you trust in something that you're doing it wrong.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things this brings up for me is thinking about the faith system that I have left, that what I'm learning now about my soul and like what do I have faith in, I'm learning to trust myself. And, I've always had that little inside voice that I've kind of was taught to not listen to and gaslighted. Oh no, that's not what it was, And then I was like, oh, I guess that's not what it was. And when you do that, when that happens when you're little, your brain doesn't know through, well, I don't have to believe that person. And I think growing up in the church, there was so much fear that fear got into my bones. And so, just fast forward to leaving, a faith of certainty was just frightening. It was so frightening. And then to learn that, oh, I can trust myself. I can trust my perceptions. And then the other thing about that too is that I have noticed that for most of my life I've been hiding behind my faith, using it as an excuse for this and that, or trying to get people to don't be anxious, but in everything by fear, by supplication and blah, 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 whatever that verse is, just to believe that God's going to take care of you. And then when things happened, when, it didn't seem like God was taking care of people, or, I don't know, it's just, this whole reading and your whole book about the soul just keeps bringing up to me that we need to be present, but not just present with others, but present with ourselves. And I think you've kind of been saying that, and so that's what it keeps reminding me of whenever I hear you read. It kind of doesn't even matter what part of the book you read, but that theme kind of keeps coming up.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I very much have enjoyed this.
Thanks.
And I was just going to add something. Thank you. First of all, thank you for sharing. I'm very relaxed and just taking all this in, but I would say I too come from a similar background as you. Felt very safe and secure, and if something happened, I could pray my way through it and I would be just fine. In fact, I went to an evangelical church where the pastor actually passed away, and they prayed for him in the hospital room that he would raise from the dead, and all that. And people literally left the church because they thought, he must have been living in sin. Yeah, because he was sick. I mean, that's the kind of background, and it's just like this. Kind of like that safety net, like, oh, I'm gonna be fine. And that person, they're only in that. It's like that. They're only in that situation because they didn't pray hard enough, or they, blah blah blah. Which I know sounds horrible as I'm saying it. I'm like, oh, but it does make you feel like you have like the magic pill, or you have like the magic thing, and then, but also with that, you're inundated with fear. And you're inundated with, oh, like, I'm not, like, my voice isn't important. What I think, I mean, I literally almost got sent home from a volunteer mission trip because I started asking questions. And, you're taught to kind of be disembodied from who you are. And like Kelly was talking about, that inner voice. And I found so much in my feeling through all of this, because as I started to deconstruct, I felt like everything I believe got ripped from underneath me. But cultivating that ability to trust myself and to embrace like my voice and my thoughts, because like the church I came from, the pastor knew best, and if the pastor said it, then that is what you did. It didn't matter what you felt. It didn't matter, because you were kind of gaslit away from your own inner knowledge. So I think that this is a really powerful, because then it almost made me want to completely just walk away from faith in general, because I equated faith to that manipulation. And so I appreciate this chapter, like faith as presence and being with yourself, and cultivating that relationship with self, with your soul, and leaning into the magic of being a human. And with that comes the paradox of joy and pain and suffering and helplessness and excitement and creativity, like all those things living together in one place. And actually life is so much more rich when we do that. So anyways, even though it's scary as hell, and it's like, you kind of have these little like freak out moments, like every other minute, but it's like, but it's, anyway, I don't know. I just appreciate your perspective, and I like the scaffolding versus the safety net, in my head. I'm a visual person, so like scaffolding kind of, like you have like this safety, but it's like within the freedom, I guess, of being who you are. So.
I think that scaffolding feels more supportive and interactive.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky to write about it. It's tricky to communicate, what I'm trying to communicate. Kelly, thanks for that summary, because I wasn't sure I was communicating anything here very well. So good. I'm glad you got that. I'm noticing we have about 4 minutes left. I kind of want to be faithful to the time. Anybody have anything else, or a question, or something you need to hear before we go, or you're still confused? Oops. Do you think, well, we'll see what my editor thinks, but it sounds like it's a little bit murky territory. Do you think there needs to be a little bit more attention to what it is, what it isn't, that kind of thing? Okay. We'll let Caleb decide. Luckily, he's familiar with some of these concepts, so I think he'll be able to advise me. Okay, well, this has been more enjoyable than I thought it would be. I especially enjoy seeing our visitors from out of state and those who haven't been here for a while. Really appreciate that. And so we'll try to do the next thing, we'll try to do the same thing in May. And I'm thinking I don't know what the date is, if it's the 1st or the 9th or the 8th. May is always weird that way.
He is, I think you said it, well, you must have said it for the second, because we were going to.
Oh, it's the 2nd. Okay, it's the 2nd then. Good, thank you. So yeah, we'll just do the same thing and be happy to see whoever can come. So I will, thank you. I will edit the recording down and post it on the website. And yeah, hope to see you next time. Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Phyllis.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll hang out
Thank you.
for a while.